This is our Titan XP mod. We took an EVGA hybrid cooler, which is just a CLC, stuck it onto the Titan XP, and tested it to see if the clock speeds were increased just by removing the thermal barrier, or if we could smooth out the clocks over time. We have all of that testing for you here today. Thanks to reader Grant for loaning us the card. And before we get into that, this coverage is brought to you by iFixit.com, who provided the tools used for our teardown and this mod. You can go to ifixit.com/gamersnexus and use code gamersnexus for $5 off of an order $10 or more. We would recommend the ProTech Toolkit, which is linked in the description below. So today's goal is to look at how this performs against itself with the stock cooler as it was originally sold. The unit is $1,200 for the NVIDIA Titan XP. That's the new one, 2017 edition. And we ripped off the cooler because normally with the Founders Edition mods, if you pull that cooler off, we find that the performance in terms of clocks versus time and temperature improves with a better cooling solution like this one. Now, you could run the VRM fan at something like 80% and have similar results, but this helps us in a few ways that we weren't expecting because we're now measuring VRAM temperatures alongside the power component temperatures, which we haven't always done for these mods. So the VRAM temperature in particular is new for us. We've got results on that today. Other than this, the mod it's about a $100 liquid cooler kit. When you're spending $1,200, it's kind of hard to gauge at what point value still matters. This is not a card for gamers. As we said in our gaming review of the Titan XP, you'd be better off with something like a 1080 Ti because when they're overclocked or stock, it's pretty much the same performance. But that's for the Titan XP review that we already posted. What we're doing here today is just looking at how does it perform thermally and does it improve by changing the cooler, not necessarily looking at is it worth buying. You can check our review for that. And before getting into the test data, as always, testing methodology is linked in the description below. So we've got the full article on this there, which will have a few extra charts not found in this video. And it's also got the methodology, including how we're using thermocouples to measure different temperatures of components on the card. So you can check that link for more information on all of that. Let's start with an easy chart. This one is frequency versus time, showing the performance of the Titan XP stock versus our hybrid mod. There isn't a tremendous frequency difference here, not like we've seen in past mods, but there's a big swing in thermals, as you'd expect. We'll talk more about that aspect in a moment. With regard to clocks, the hybrid mod is able to boost slightly higher in this power virus scenario, averaging about 1443 megahertz core, whereas the stock card with the stock cooler and auto settings ran 1392 megahertz on the core. That's an extra 50 megahertz or so without any overclocking effort, so not bad. But the Titan XP is up against its clock limit already, so gains are minimal. Note also that these tests are conducted with a power virus scenario, so that means that the clock is enumerated differently from a gaming workload. That's okay because we're just trying to stress the card thermally, but if you were testing it with games, you'd see a higher clock and lower temperatures overall on the power components. Getting into tests that involve our thermocouple measurements on the VRAM and MOSFETs, this chart shows our original Titan XP results with the stock cooler before the mod. GPU diode temperatures were locked at around 84C, which is the card's thermal threshold for clock limiting. MOSFETs were operating around 68 to 70C in this scenario, well within reasonable operating range, and the VRAM was running parallel to the GPU temperature at about 80 to 83C. This is important. By looking at how VRAM tends to follow GPU temperature, though at a slight delay, as indicated by the 200 to 350 second mark on the chart, we learned that there is a need to pay attention to thermal density with these tests. Rolling into the next chart with our hybrid mod using a 23% VRM fan and 100% radiator, we now see the GPU diode temperatures around 40C, having the GPU diode reading previously. MOSFET and power component temperatures are almost identical to the previous test, though note that the hybrid does take longer to ramp its FET temperatures than the stock card. Ultimately, we're not worse off for the FETs, but we can maintain equal temperatures with just 23% on the VRM fan, rather than north of 50 to 55%. VRAM is interesting and is the newest item we've added to our measurements. VRAM temperature with the hybrid has dropped down to about 75C on the module we're measuring, whereas it was previously around 82C. Our current hypothesis is that this reduction is primarily because of the increased efficiency with which heat is removed from the GPU, reducing heat between all of the VRAM modules. The VRAM is primarily cooled by the base plate, so removing that vapor chamber didn't hurt VRAM temperatures at all. In fact, it actually helped since we can now focus all of our air cooling efforts strictly on power and VRAM components. and the GPU is taken care of within a closed loop, as indicated by the EVGA CLC mounted to the GPU proper. If 100% radiator fan speed is too high for noise reasons, we also tested at 40% speed by plugging into the motherboard directly. This is where we can see the 100% radiator fan speed exhibiting diminishing returns, considering our 40% GPU diode temperature is only 12 to 13 C higher and still around the 50 C mark max. Noise is measurably lower at this speed, as we'll show in a bit, with temperatures still under control. VRAM temperature is still improved with this fan speed, with FET temperature still tied with the stock configuration, making 40% pretty appealing overall. Here's a GN EQ chart to make things easier to read. Over the same test period and averaging a few hundred cells of data after accounting for ambient, we see the hybrid mod benefits performance of the measured power and VRAM components alongside the expected GPU diode improvement. Interestingly, again, it almost makes more sense to run a fan to the motherboard directly and then just set it to something like 40% while leaving the VRM fan at 23%. We're cooling everything adequately and operating at a lower noise level than stock, with 100% speeds on the EVGA fan not really posting significant benefits over 40% speeds, but still performing louder. These components are exciting to start measuring, seeing as we've always known that hybrid mods benefit GPU diode temperatures, but we weren't sure how they affected componentry. Now we know, it's still better. All this talk about noise, let's take a look at the noise chart. First of all, the idle temperature listed for the hybrid mod is when running the fan at a 40% noise profile as plugged into the motherboard directly. At 40% on the radiator fan and 23% on the VRM fan, our idle noise output is about 32.5 dBA, higher than idle for other devices, including the original Titan XP, but that's because we've added another case fan to the mix. And again, this test uses a bench that is entirely passive other than the GPU proper. Auto, where the radiator fan is running at 100%, our output is 39.1 dBA. The stock cooler for the Titan XP operated at around 48 dBA here, which is nearly 2 times louder by human perception given the logarithmic scale. Here's the thing, if you wanted to keep that 40% radiator fan speed, since we've shown it worked just fine in our test configuration, the difference would be even bigger. We'd be looking at a 47.9 dBA for auto on the stock cooler, as opposed to 32.5 dBA for the 40% radiator fan and 23% VRM fan, even when under load. 33 dBA to 48 decibels is a huge jump in perceived noise and makes it pretty convincing to just run a hybrid cooler with a 40% fan speed. We don't normally get major gains with overclocking in these hybrid mods, but increased clock stability ultimately yields higher performance metrics in gaming anyway. We saw some increases in peak frequency for each overclock step with this mod, ultimately settling at a 225 MHz offset. Here's the overclock stepping for the Titan XP stock card, which will bump up to make room for the hybrid OC stepping. Boosting memory speed beyond 450 to 500 MHz produced diminishing returns as it dragged down the core clock, likely due to power limit and availability. For gaming, the core clock is normally going to matter more than the additional memory overclock, so we ran with a 450 to 500 MHz memory clock, depending on how it impacted the core. Let's get into some gaming benchmarks. We'll have all of these in the article linked to the description below, but go over a few results here. Start off with Ghost Recon Wildlands at 4K. The Titan XP stock card operated at an average frame rate of 60 FPS with lows at 52 and 48. Without any overclock, our Titan XP hybrid mod improves to 61 FPS average with 54 FPS 1% low and 50 FPS 0.1% low. That's not a huge jump at about a 1.7% improvement, but it's an improvement nonetheless. Overclocking the stock card landed us at 65 FPS average, and overclocking the hybrid bumped that to 68 FPS average. The result is a 4.6% improvement in performance when comparing OC to OC. At 1440p, it's a similar story. The stock Titan XP runs a 95 FPS average, 75 FPS 1% low, and 72 FPS 0.1% lows. The hybrid mod helps pull low performance up to 85 and 82, notably with averages at 97 FPS average. Overclocking performance shows the same limited gains. We experience a bump in average with a bigger jump upward in frame time consistency. Here's a frame time chart showing the non-overclocked frame times of the stock Titan XP and the hybrid Titan XP, just to illustrate the difference. It's not huge, but you can definitely see it. Running Mass Effect Andromeda at 4K, the Titan XP stock card performed with an average FPS of 68, lows at 56 and 53, while the hybrid version runs a 71 FPS average and lows at 57 and 53. The stock-to-stock improvement is about 4.4% for this one. For 1440p and 1080p results for this game, check the article linked to the description below. Let's look at Doom with Vulkan and async enabled. The Titan XP stock card operated at a frame rate of 94 FPS average, which improved to 108 FPS average when overclocked. The hybrid mod, meanwhile, lands at 99 FPS average, So it's 5.5% ahead of the stock Titan XP cooler, and overclocking gets us to 113 FPS average for an increase of 4.3% over the Titan XP air-cooled card when overclocked, or an improvement of 13% over the hybrid mod with no OC. One final game for this video, then we'll close out. The rest of these game tests will be in the link in the description below, along with 3D Mark. Sniper Elite 4 with DX12 and Async places the Titan XP stock at 87 FPS average, with the hybrid card bumping up to 94 FPS average without any overclocks applied. That's just from the thermal headroom improvement from the hybrid cooler, so not bad. This improves our performance by about 7.8% over the stock cooler. Overclocking the Titan XP with its stock cooler gets the card to 98 FPS average for a gain of 12.2% over baseline. The Titan XP hybrid overclocked a bit higher and held onto the frame times better, netting 101 FPS average on the OC. So that more or less wraps it up. This is more about the noise and thermal improvements than gaming improvements. With gaming, as we just went through, it's not a huge deal for the most part. The very best case was Sniper Elite, where we've seen something like an 8% improvement just from that change. So we're not really seeing anything major otherwise. The noise department's a completely different story, because that can be dragged down to less than 40 decibels in our passive testing environment with a noise floor of about 26 dBA and perform better thermally and actually better in FPS for the most part than, well, actually definitely better in FPS, just it's a limited percentage, than the stock Titan XP with the stock air cooler. It's not a bad mod. If you are spending $1,200 anyway, an extra $100 doesn't sound too daunting. I would like to see this kind of cooling improved on in the future for reference cards. It's probably not going to happen. There's a reason reference cards are designed the way they are. AMD and NVIDIA both do the blower fan designs. They are easier for SIs to implement. They are more versatile. So it makes sense for them to do that, especially because if you're mass producing them, it's cheaper to just buy a whole bunch of one cooler. But if you're in the mood to mod something, it's an easy mod to do. This is just not something we recommend for gaming still, but if you're buying it for something like machine learning, like Grant did, then maybe it's worth considering. Look into that for your uses, depending on how you feel about noise levels of the stock cooler and how you feel about temperature output, depending on what else is in the box. As for the rest, one quick note on the game For Honor. We've had interesting bugs with For Honor throughout all of the testing we've done with it. It does just fine when the cards are stock, but as soon as we overclock them, a lot of them have weird instability issues, and it seems to be just that that particular game is causing more problems with clock stability and overclock stability than the other games we test. Just something with how it's optimized or how the shaders are used or something like that. This card, in its hybrid state, actually had problems with For Honor to the point where I had to downclock it back to make sure it was stuck at the original stock Titan XP settings before the hybrid mod, because it would actually start stuttering to a point where the game was unplayable even at 4K. But if you drop the clocks down so that they're similar or equal to the Titan XP stock cooler version of the card, then it did better. It was fine. So really weird issue. That was For Honor only. None of the other games had that. For the rest of the information, as always, link in the description below. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly if you like this type of in-depth content and would like to help fund it. Or if you don't want to do that, you can pick up a shirt, store.gamersnexus.net, for one like this. We're adding tri-blends. Should be in stock this week. So thank you for watching as always. I'll see you all next time.